The Rutherford County Historical Society maintains its newspaper archive in a converted warehouse on East Main Street in Murfreesboro, where microfilm readers sit in rows beneath fluorescent lights, and where every edition of the Daily News Journal from 1869 forward waits in carefully cataloged boxes for researchers seeking connections to Middle Tennessee's past. A genealogist named Daniel Carpenter discovered an impossible pattern in those archives during the fall of 2020 while tracing his family's history through Rutherford County, finding 47 different newspaper articles published between 1973 and 1981 that mentioned a man named Gregory Vincent Lattimore, in contexts ranging from business openings to civic committee appointments to charitable fundraising to public meetings about local development. The articles described Lattimore as a prominent Murfreesboro businessman, a community leader involved in numerous organizations, an investor in local real estate, a frequent participant in municipal affairs, always presented as someone whose opinions and activities merited newspaper coverage, and whose presence in Murfreesboro civic life appeared entirely routine and unremarkable. Yet when Daniel attempted to locate Lattimore in city directories, census records, property deeds, voter registration files, business licenses, or any other documentation beyond those 47 newspaper mentions, he found absolutely nothing indicating that Gregory Vincent Lattimore had ever actually lived in Murfreesboro or anywhere else in Tennessee. The absence of supporting documentation would be puzzling for anyone who appeared even occasionally in local news coverage, but for someone mentioned 47 times across 8 years, the void becomes impossible to explain through normal gaps in record-keeping or archival preservation, because the kind of civic involvement that generates that much newspaper attention necessarily creates extensive documentation through property ownership, business registration, organizational membership, tax payments, and countless other transactions that leave permanent traces in the administrative systems that govern American life. Gregory Vincent Lattimore appeared to exist only in the pages of the Daily News Journal, a ghost whose supposed activities and opinions the newspaper documented with apparent care, while every other institution in Murfreesboro remained completely unaware of his presence in their community. Daniel's discovery would have remained a curious anomaly, perhaps dismissed as confusion between microfilm from different newspapers that had somehow been misfiled, except that the articles about Lattimore appeared in proper chronological sequence among coverage of verifiable Murfreesboro events, describing his participation in activities that demonstrably occurred even as his individual presence at those events left no trace in any record except the newspaper's own reporting. The pattern of impossible presence became even more disturbing when Daniel examined the specific contexts in which Lattimore's name appeared and realized that the 47 articles clustered around particular types of civic activities, primarily those involving racial integration, affordable housing development, environmental protection, and labor rights during a period when Murfreesboro was experiencing rapid growth that generated intense conflict about development priorities and social change. A March 1974 article described Lattimore speaking at a city council meeting in support of fair housing ordinances that would prevent landlords from discriminating against African American renters, quoting him as arguing that Murfreesboro's growth should benefit all residents regardless of race. A September 1976 piece covered his involvement in organizing opposition to a proposed industrial facility that would have brought pollution to a predominantly black neighborhood, presenting him as coordinator of a citizens' coalition demanding environmental justice. A June 1978 story detailed his work with a nonprofit organization providing legal assistance to low-wage workers facing exploitation by employers, describing his fundraising efforts and his vision for protecting vulnerable Murfreesboro residents from predatory business practices that the city's rapid expansion had enabled. Subscribe now, because what we've uncovered about this phantom activist reveals a sophisticated strategy that progressive organizers developed to advance civil rights and social justice goals in southern cities, where openly advocating those positions invited violence, professional destruction, and coordinated efforts by local power structures to silence anyone who challenged the region's traditional hierarchies of race and class. Murfreesboro sits 35 miles southeast of Nashville along Interstate 24, positioned at the geographic center of Tennessee and rolling countryside that transitions between the Nashville Basin's agricultural landscapes and the foothills of the Cumberland Plateau. The city spent most of its history as a modest county seat serving the surrounding farming communities. Home to Middle Tennessee State University, which provided educational opportunities and cultural resources that distinguished Murfreesboro from other small southern cities of comparable size. The 1970s brought dramatic transformation as Nashville's suburban expansion reached southward into Rutherford County, converting farmland into subdivisions and shopping centers, attracting new residents who worked in Nashville but sought more affordable housing in communities beyond the capital city's immediate periphery. This rapid growth created enormous tensions between longtime residents who wanted to preserve Murfreesboro's small-town character and newcomers who brought different expectations about development, services, and social organization, with battles over zoning, school integration, environmental protection, and affordable housing dominating local politics throughout the decade. The city's relationship with its Civil War history added another layer of complexity to these contemporary conflicts, because Murfreesboro had been the site of the Battle of Stones River in late 1862 and early 1863, one of the war's bloodiest engagements, and the community maintained careful preservation of battlefield sites and Confederate memorials that anchored a particular narrative about Southern heritage and regional identity. Many white residents during the 1970s viewed challenges to segregation and advocacy for racial equality as attacks on traditions that extended back to the antebellum period, connecting contemporary civil rights activism to what they perceived as the same external interference that had destroyed the Old South during Reconstruction. This conflation of historical grievance with contemporary politics created an atmosphere where supporting integration or racial justice could be interpreted as betraying Southern heritage, exposing advocates to social ostracism, economic retaliation, and sometimes violence from people who saw themselves as defending their community against forces that threatened its essential character. Against this fraught backdrop, someone advocating openly for fair housing, environmental justice in black neighborhoods, and protection for exploited workers would become an immediate target for the organized resistance that Murfreesboro's conservative establishment deployed against what they termed outside agitators and race-mixing liberals, meaning that genuinely advancing those causes required either extraordinary courage combined with willingness to accept severe consequences, or alternatively finding indirect methods that could achieve progress while protecting advocates from the backlash that destroyed people who challenged the status quo too directly. The newspaper articles about Gregory Vincent Lattimore suggested that someone had developed a strategy of the latter type, creating a fictional activist whose name could be attached to controversial positions and organizing efforts without any actual person having to face the retaliation that white supremacists and pro-development business interests directed at anyone who opposed their vision for Murfreesboro's future. The phantom activist could attend city council meetings that never saw his face, could coordinate organizing campaigns that never required his physical presence, could be quoted in newspaper articles advocating positions that no one had to defend in personal confrontation, serving as a kind of ideological scarecrow that progressive organizers could deploy to make their causes appear to have broader support than might otherwise be visible. Daniel's investigation into the 47 newspaper articles revealed a pattern where Lattimore's supposed activities consistently aligned with initiatives that Murfreesboro's progressive organizations were actually pursuing during the 1970s, suggesting that the phantom activist functioned as a public face for organizing work that was genuinely occurring even if the specific individual supposedly leading it did not exist. The March 1974 article about his city council testimony in support of fair housing coincided with a documented push by the Rutherford County Human Relations Council to strengthen anti-discrimination ordinances, meaning that while Gregory Vincent Lattimore himself was fictional, the advocacy attributed to him represented real organizing efforts by actual people who might have found it strategic to have their work associated with a name that couldn't be targeted for retaliation. The September 1976 coverage of his environmental justice organizing corresponded with verified opposition to the proposed industrial facility from residents of the affected neighborhood, with Lattimore serving as a convenient focal point for newspaper coverage that might have been more difficult to obtain if reporters had to identify multiple individual activists who could then face harassment from the facility's corporate backers. The June 1978 story about worker protection advocacy aligned with activities that several Murfreesboro nonprofits and religious organizations were genuinely conducting, providing legal assistance, and organizing support for low-wage workers in the city's expanding service and manufacturing sectors, work that occurred regardless of whether Gregory Vincent Lattimore actually existed to coordinate it. The consistent pattern suggested that progressive organizers had essentially created a brand identity for their collective work, attributing various initiatives to a fictional individual who could be presented to the media and to the public as a leader and spokesperson without anyone having to personally assume the risks that came with public visibility in those roles. This strategy would have required cooperation from sympathetic newspaper reporters who understood what they were documenting and who were willing to present Lattimore as a real person, despite knowing or suspecting that he existed only as a convenient fiction, raising questions about journalistic ethics that became complicated when considering that the alternative might have been having no newspaper coverage at all for organizing work that genuinely served Murfreesboro's most vulnerable residents. The mechanics of maintaining Gregory Vincent Lattimore as a convincing newspaper presence across 47 articles spanning 8 years would have required careful coordination between organizers and journalists, with someone providing quotes and information attributed to Lattimore in contexts that appeared legitimate enough to pass editorial scrutiny while avoiding details that might prompt verification efforts. The articles about Lattimore never included photographs, always relying on text descriptions of his supposed statements and activities, preventing the kind of visual documentation that would make it obvious that no consistent individual existed behind the name. The coverage avoided providing specific biographical details like age, residence address, educational background, or professional credentials that reporters would normally include when introducing readers to someone appearing in news coverage for the first time, maintaining strategic vagueness that prevented accumulation of checkable facts that might expose the fiction. Quotes attributed to Lattimore followed patterns of careful generality, articulating positions and arguments without the kind of distinctive voice or personality that would create expectations about how this person should sound in future coverage, allowing different people to craft statements under his name without creating obvious inconsistencies. The newspaper's apparent willingness to publish dozens of articles about Lattimore without ever investigating his actual existence suggested either that reporters were consciously participating in maintaining the fiction, or that the daily news journal's editorial standards during the 1970s were remarkably lax about verification of sources and subjects, neither possibility reflecting particularly well on the institution's journalistic practices. The more charitable interpretation would be that progressive reporters at the newspaper understood the strategic value of providing coverage for civil rights and social justice organizing in ways that protected actual participants from retaliation, using their professional positions to advance causes they believed in, while maintaining the appearance of conventional news reporting that their editors and publishers would accept. This would make them active collaborators in the phantom activist strategy, rather than dupes who were being manipulated, conscious participants in a resistance tactic rather than journalists who failed at basic verification responsibilities. Daniel's research into the Daily News Journal's staffing during the 1970s revealed that the newspaper employed several reporters who had connections to progressive religious organizations and civil rights groups in Murfreesboro, creating plausible channels through which the phantom activist strategy could have been coordinated. One reporter, Michael Patterson, had previously worked for the Nashville Tennessean covering civil rights stories during the 1960s, before moving to Murfreesboro in 1971, bringing both professional experience with racial justice issues and established relationships with activist networks that would have made him a logical point of contact for organizers seeking sympathetic media coverage. Another reporter, Susan Chen, had been active in anti-war organizing during her college years and maintained involvement with peace and justice groups after joining the Daily News Journal's staff in 1973, positioning her as someone who might support creative strategies for advancing progressive causes in a conservative community. The bylines on articles mentioning Gregory Vincent Lattimore showed that Patterson and Chen had written approximately 32 of the 47 pieces, with the remaining 15 distributed among other reporters whose politics were less clearly progressive, but who might simply have been passing along information provided by what they assumed were legitimate sources. This concentration of Lattimore coverage among the newspaper's most politically progressive reporters strongly suggested conscious coordination rather than coincidental assignment patterns, indicating that certain journalists had essentially volunteered to handle coverage of the phantom activist as part of a broader strategy they understood and supported. Neither Patterson nor Chen remained alive to be interviewed about their work during the 1970s, both having died in the early 2010s, taking with them whatever direct knowledge they possessed about whether Gregory Vincent Lattimore had been a real person they had met and interviewed, or a useful fiction they had helped maintain to protect actual organizers from targeted retaliation. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Daniel discovered that Murfreesboro's municipal archives contained meeting minutes and official documents that corroborated some events the newspaper had described Lattimore attending or participating in, confirming that the activities attributed to the phantom activist had actually occurred, even if his individual presence at them remained unverifiable. City Council minutes from March 1974 recorded public testimony supporting fair housing ordinances during a meeting the newspaper had described Lattimore attending, though the official minutes identified speakers only by the order in which they addressed the council, rather than by name, leaving no way to confirm whether someone claiming to be Gregory Vincent Lattimore had actually spoken, or whether the newspaper had invented his participation after the fact. Planning Commission records from September 1976 documented organized opposition to the proposed industrial facility, listing a citizens' coalition as having submitted formal complaints, though again without naming specific individuals involved in the organizing, creating space where Lattimore's supposed coordination role could be fictional, without contradicting official documentation that the opposition itself was real. This pattern of official records confirming events while omitting individual identities suggested that Murfreesboro's bureaucratic record-keeping during the 1970s either deliberately avoided documenting who participated in public meetings and civic processes, or that those records had been subsequently modified to remove identifying information that might expose participants to later retaliation. The strategic ambiguity in official minutes served similar purposes to the phantom activist strategy, allowing genuine organizing and advocacy to occur while protecting the specific people involved from having their names permanently associated with controversial positions in government archives that hostile authorities could later search. The combination of official records that confirmed events without naming participants and newspaper coverage that attributed those events to a fictional individual created layered protection for actual organizers, ensuring that even if someone investigated the newspaper's claims, they would find corroborating evidence that something had indeed happened without being able to identify real people who could be targeted for their involvement. The question of who actually did the organizing work attributed to Gregory Vincent Lattimore led Daniel to examine Murfreesboro's progressive organizational landscape during the 1970s, identifying several groups that were actively working on fair housing, environmental justice, and worker protection issues that aligned with the phantom activists' supposed focus areas. The Rutherford County Human Relations Council, established in 1968 to promote racial understanding and equal opportunity, had been particularly active during the mid-1970s, advocating for stronger anti-discrimination policies and supporting African American residents facing housing and employment discrimination. The Stones River Watershed Association, formed in 1975 by residents concerned about pollution from industrial development, had organized opposition to facilities that threatened environmental quality in vulnerable neighborhoods. The Middle Tennessee Workers Alliance, a coalition of labor unions and community organizations, had provided legal assistance and organizing support for low-wage workers throughout the decade. All three organizations operated with relatively low public profiles during the 1970s, maintaining small memberships and avoiding the kind of prominent media presence that might invite attention from conservative forces that wanted to suppress their work. Yet the activities attributed to Gregory Vincent Lattimore in newspaper coverage aligned almost perfectly with these groups' documented initiatives. This correlation suggested that Lattimore might have served as a media proxy for collective organizing efforts, allowing multiple organizations to coordinate advocacy campaigns under a single name that could receive newspaper coverage without exposing the actual people and groups doing the work. The strategy would have been particularly valuable during a period when being publicly identified as supporting civil rights or opposing business interests could result in job loss, social ostracism, or violence, creating strong incentives for organizers to find ways to advance their causes while maintaining personal anonymity. Daniel's interviews with surviving members of these 1970s organizations produced carefully neutral responses when asked about Gregory Vincent Lattimore, with most people claiming they didn't recall the name, despite newspaper articles describing his involvement in activities their organizations had coordinated. One former Human Relations Council board member acknowledged that the group had sometimes used pseudonyms when providing information to reporters about housing discrimination cases, protecting both victims and advocates from retaliation, while ensuring that important stories received media coverage. A retired member of the Watershed Association mentioned that environmental organizing during the 1970s had sometimes required creative approaches to getting public attention without putting individual activists at risk, though she wouldn't elaborate on what specific creative approaches her group had employed. These carefully vague responses suggested that people who had been involved in Murfreesboro's progressive organizing during that period understood that Gregory Vincent Lattimore represented something other than a conventional activist whose work should be straightforwardly remembered, though they declined to explicitly confirm that he had been a phantom whose supposed activities actually represented their own collective efforts. The most revealing interview came from Reverend James Howard Mitchell, who had led Murfreesboro's First Baptist Church during the 1970s, and who had been quietly involved in supporting civil rights and social justice organizing during a period when most white clergy avoided taking public positions on controversial issues. Mitchell, now in his 80s and no longer constrained by institutional responsibilities, acknowledged that progressive organizers in Murfreesboro had indeed developed strategies for advancing their work while protecting participants from the violent backlash that characterized white resistance to racial equality and economic justice during that era. He described an atmosphere where supporting integration or advocating for workers' rights could result in crosses being burned on lawns, threatening phone calls, economic boycotts against businesses owned by suspected sympathizers, and physical violence against people identified as troublemakers who were challenging traditional Southern social hierarchies. In that context, Mitchell explained, organizers had to balance the need for public advocacy that could influence policy and shift community attitudes against the equally critical need to protect people from retaliation that could destroy their livelihoods and endanger their families, creating incentives to develop approaches that achieved the former goal while minimizing the latter risk. He stopped short of explicitly confirming that Gregory Vincent Lattimore had been a phantom activist created for exactly those purposes, but his description of the strategic environment made clear that such tactics would have been entirely rational, and that he would have understood and possibly supported their use if they had indeed been employed. Mitchell's testimony provided the clearest evidence that Murfreesboro's progressive organizing community during the 1970s had operated in ways that required deception and indirection, creating fictional public faces for real work that had to remain partially hidden to protect the actual people doing it. The newspaper coverage of Gregory Vincent Lattimore extended beyond simple documentation of his supposed attendance at meetings or involvement in organizing campaigns, with several articles presenting him as someone with specific expertise and authority on issues related to civil rights law, environmental regulation, and labor policy, suggesting that whoever created the phantom activist had invested significant effort in establishing credentials and knowledge that would make his opinions appear worth soliciting and publishing. A January 1975 article about proposed changes to Murfreesboro's housing code quoted Lattimore extensively about how the changes would affect compliance with federal fair housing requirements, presenting him as someone with detailed knowledge of civil rights legislation and its local implementation. An April 1977 piece about water quality regulations included Lattimore's analysis of how Tennessee environmental laws applied to industrial permits, positioning him as someone with technical expertise about pollution control and regulatory compliance. These presentations of specialized knowledge required that whoever was providing information to reporters under Lattimore's name actually possessed the relevant expertise, meaning the phantom activist wasn't simply a convenient fiction, but rather a vehicle through which real experts could share their knowledge while maintaining anonymity that protected them from retaliation. A lawyer specializing in civil rights law might provide detailed analysis of fair housing requirements without having to attach their own name to positions that could alienate potential clients or invite harassment from segregationists. An environmental scientist could offer technical assessments of pollution impacts without facing professional consequences from industries that might retaliate against critics. The phantom activist became a mask that allowed people with genuine expertise to contribute their knowledge to public discourse, without accepting the personal risks that would have come from direct attribution of their views to their actual identities. Daniel's examination of the specific information that articles attributed to Lattimore revealed a level of accuracy and sophistication that confirmed whoever was speaking under that name possessed legitimate expertise rather than simply offering political opinions dressed up as technical knowledge. The Housing Code analysis included specific citations to federal regulations and correct descriptions of how those requirements interacted with local ordinances, details that would have required someone with actual legal training in civil rights law to provide. The environmental assessments referenced particular pollutants and their health effects with scientific precision that indicated genuine technical background rather than amateur understanding. The labor law discussions demonstrated detailed familiarity with Tennessee employment regulations and federal wage and hour standards that could only have come from someone with professional experience in that field. This level of sophisticated knowledge distribution through the phantom activist suggested a broader network of professional expertise supporting Murfreesboro's progressive organizing than might have been visible if individual experts had to publicly attach their names to their contributions, revealing that the phantom activist strategy enabled coalition building that brought together lawyers, scientists, academics, and other professionals who possessed valuable knowledge but who couldn't safely share it under their own identities without facing career consequences. The strategy essentially created an alternate channel for expert participation in public discourse, allowing people whose institutional positions might prohibit or discourage political advocacy to nevertheless contribute their expertise to debates about policy and justice while maintaining the professional neutrality their employers or professional associations required. The temporal pattern of Lattimore's newspaper appearances showed interesting correlation with specific political and social conflicts in Murfreesboro, with his supposed activity intensifying during periods when progressive causes faced particularly strong opposition, and diminishing during relatively calmer periods when overt advocacy carried fewer risks. The highest concentration of articles appeared during 1976 and 1977, years when Murfreesboro experienced intense conflict over school integration implementation and over zoning decisions that affected the geographic distribution of affordable housing, both issues where organized white resistance had become violent and where people advocating for integration and housing access faced serious threats. Lattimore's supposed prominence during those particular years suggested that the phantom activist had been deployed most heavily exactly when real organizers needed maximum protection from the backlash their work was generating, with his fictional presence providing cover during the most dangerous periods of advocacy. The pattern inverted during 1979 and 1980, when Lattimore's newspaper appearances declined to just 3 articles across those 2 years, coinciding with a period when federal court orders had largely resolved school integration questions and when some of the most intense local resistance had dissipated as opponents accepted that certain changes had become inevitable, regardless of their preferences. The reduced need for the phantom activist during calmer periods suggested that his deployment had been strategic rather than automatic, with organizers apparently making conscious decisions about when the protection of fictional attribution was necessary and when actual advocates could potentially operate under their own names without facing unacceptable retaliation. This strategic modulation demonstrated sophisticated assessment of risk and careful calibration of tactics to match evolving conditions, indicating that whoever managed the phantom activist fiction possessed both political sophistication and accurate understanding of Murfreesboro's social dynamics. The final article mentioning Gregory Vincent Lattimore appeared in the Daily News Journal on October 12, 1981, describing his participation in a public forum about economic development and its impact on longtime Murfreesboro residents, presenting his concerns that rapid growth was displacing low-income families and destroying established neighborhoods without adequate consideration of social costs. The article included no indication that this would be Lattimore's last appearance in the newspaper's coverage, no suggestion that he was departing Murfreesboro or reducing his civic involvement, simply treating his participation in this forum as another routine instance of his ongoing engagement with community affairs. Yet he never appeared in subsequent newspaper coverage, despite the continued relevance of issues he had supposedly championed, and despite ongoing organizing work by Murfreesboro's progressive groups on housing, environmental, and labor questions throughout the 1980s and beyond. The abrupt disappearance suggested that whoever had been maintaining the Gregory Vincent Lattimore fiction decided that the strategy had either served its purpose or that changed circumstances made it no longer necessary or advisable to continue operating through a phantom activist identity. By 1981, many of the most contentious battles over civil rights implementation had been settled through federal court orders and legislative changes that made certain forms of discrimination illegal regardless of local preferences, reducing, though not eliminating, the risks that advocates faced when publicly supporting integration and equal treatment. The Reagan administration's election in 1980 signaled shifts in federal civil rights enforcement that would create new challenges for progressive organizing, but also new contexts where different tactics might be more effective than the phantom activist approach that had served during the 1970s. Alternatively, the disappearance might indicate that key participants in maintaining the Lattimore fiction had left Murfreesboro or changed their circumstances in ways that made continuing the strategy impractical, with reporters Michael Patterson and Susan Chen both having moved to other newspapers by the early 1980s, and with some of the progressive organizations that had supported the phantom activist having dissolved or transformed as their leadership changed. The mechanics of coordinating the fiction across multiple years and dozens of newspaper articles would have required sustained collaboration among several people, and if key participants were no longer available or willing to continue the arrangement, the entire strategy would have become untenable regardless of whether it might still have served useful purposes. Daniel's research into Murfreesboro organizing from the 1980s onward found that progressive advocates increasingly operated under their own names as the social and political climate evolved, though many still faced harassment and opposition from conservative forces that resented their work on behalf of racial justice, affordable housing, and worker protection. The shift toward more open advocacy might have reflected both changing circumstances that made phantom activists less necessary and also generational changes in organizing philosophy, with younger activists sometimes criticizing the kind of indirect tactics their predecessors had employed as insufficiently confrontational and as perpetuating, rather than challenging, the climate of fear that made people afraid to advocate openly for justice. These debates about tactics and strategy created tensions within Murfreesboro's progressive community that complicated efforts to document and evaluate approaches like the phantom activist that had been employed during earlier periods. The broader pattern of Gregory Vincent Lattimore's newspaper presence and then disappearance raised questions about how many other similar phantom activists might have operated in southern cities during the civil rights era and its aftermath, using fictional identities to advance real organizing work while protecting actual participants from retaliation, leaving behind documentary traces in newspaper archives that historians might misinterpret as evidence of specific individuals rather than recognizing as markers of sophisticated resistance strategies. Daniel's discovery prompted him to examine newspaper coverage from other Tennessee cities during the 1970s, looking for similar patterns of individuals who appeared regularly in articles about civil rights and social justice issues, but who left no trace in census records, city directories, or other documentation that should have captured their existence if they had been real people living in those communities. He found suggestive patterns in Clarksville, where a woman named Margaret Eleanor Bradford appeared in 23 newspaper articles between 1972 and 1978, advocating for school integration and fair housing, but who could not be located in any independent documentation of Clarksville residents during that period. Similar phantom activists appeared in coverage from Jackson, where someone named Robert Franklin Ashmore was quoted frequently about labor rights issues during the mid-1970s, despite leaving no other documentary trace, and in Cleveland, where Catherine Louise Mercer supposedly coordinated environmental justice organizing, without appearing in any records beyond newspaper articles about her activities. The pattern suggested a regional phenomenon, with progressive organizers across Tennessee possibly sharing strategies and tactics, including the use of phantom activists to advance their work while protecting actual participants, creating a distributed network of fictional identities that served similar purposes across different communities, facing similar challenges. The scale of this possible phantom activist network raised profound questions about how historians should interpret documentary evidence from periods when systematic oppression created incentives for resistance movements to operate through deception and misdirection, making official records and even newspaper coverage fundamentally unreliable as sources for understanding what actually occurred and who actually participated in struggles for justice and equality. Traditional historical methods that treat documentation as evidence of reality, rather than as potential performance or misdirection, become inadequate when confronting periods where truth-telling invited violence, and where survival required elaborate fictions that left permanent traces in archives that future researchers would later attempt to interpret. The phantom activists challenged assumptions that people mentioned in newspaper articles must have existed, that documentation implies reality, that archives preserve truth, rather than sometimes preserving carefully constructed alternatives to truth, that served purposes researchers can recognize only by noticing patterns of absence in what should be corroborating sources. What remains in Murfreesboro's newspaper archives is Gregory Vincent Lattimore's name, appearing in 47 articles across 8 years, describing his advocacy for fair housing and environmental justice, and worker protection during a period when supporting those causes invited harassment and violence from people who saw civil rights and economic equality as threats to traditional Southern social hierarchies, and describing his participation in organizing campaigns and public meetings that demonstrably occurred even if his individual presence at them cannot be verified through any source beyond the newspaper's own reporting, and presenting his expertise on civil rights law and environmental regulation and labor policy in ways that suggest real professionals were sharing genuine knowledge, while hiding behind a fictional identity that protected them from retaliation that could have destroyed their careers. The phantom activist exists in that documentary record as a trace of resistance strategies that had to remain partially hidden to survive, as evidence that progressive organizing in 1970s Murfreesboro required indirection and deception to protect participants while still advancing causes that serve the community's most vulnerable residents, and as a reminder that sometimes the historical record preserves not actual people, but rather the shadows of collaborative efforts by groups who understood that honest documentation of their work would expose them to consequences they couldn't accept while still believing their causes mattered enough to justify the risks they were willing to take, as long as they could find ways to take those risks collectively rather than individually. The broader implications extend beyond Murfreesboro to raise questions about how many other phantom activists might populate newspaper archives from Southern cities during the Civil Rights era. How many individuals who appear in documentation as leaders and organizers and advocates might actually represent collective identities that protected real participants while creating public faces for movements that couldn't safely operate entirely in the open, and how historians should approach documentation from periods when systems of oppression made truth-telling dangerous and made sophisticated deception a rational survival strategy for people working toward justice. Daniel's discovery challenges assumptions about the reliability of newspaper coverage and the existence of people mentioned in articles, forcing recognition that sometimes absence of corroborating documentation doesn't indicate gaps in archival preservation, but rather reveals that what appears to be evidence of an individual actually marks the presence of a collaborative fiction that served purposes researchers can understand only by recognizing patterns of strategic deception across multiple cases. The contemporary Murfreesboro has little awareness of Gregory Vincent Lattimore or the possibility that their city's 1970s progressive organizing employed phantom activists to advance civil rights and social justice causes while protecting actual participants from violent backlash, with the newspaper articles about Lattimore sitting unexamined in historical society archives, where researchers rarely look unless they have specific reasons to investigate particular individuals or events from that period. The Daily News Journal has never published retrospective coverage acknowledging that some of its 1970s reporting might have documented fictional people, and the newspaper's current staff showed no interest when Daniel shared his findings, dismissing questions about phantom activists as speculation that couldn't be definitively proven, and that might damage the publication's credibility if taken seriously. This institutional resistance to examining its own past reporting parallels broader patterns where American media organizations resist critical evaluation of how they operated during earlier periods when their coverage might have served political purposes beyond straightforward journalism, preferring to maintain myths of neutral reporting rather than acknowledge that journalists sometimes consciously participated in resistance movements by providing sympathetic coverage that advanced causes they believed in while protecting sources and participants from retaliation. The organizations that might have employed the phantom activist strategy during the 1970s either no longer exist or have evolved into different institutions with different leadership that has no direct knowledge of tactics their predecessors used and little interest in potentially controversial historical questions that might complicate their contemporary work and reputations, leaving no institutional memory that could definitively confirm or refute what the documentary evidence suggests about how Murfreesboro's progressive organizing actually operated during that difficult period. The few surviving individuals who participated in 1970s civil rights and social justice work in Murfreesboro remain reluctant to discuss tactics that involve deception, even when that deception served admirable goals. Concerned that acknowledging dishonesty might provide ammunition for contemporary opponents of progressive causes, who would use any admission of past fabrication to dismiss current advocacy as similarly unreliable, creating a strategic silence that prevents full historical accounting of how resistance movements actually functioned under conditions of severe oppression and violent opposition. Gregory Vincent Lattimore persists in Murfreesboro's documentary record as a name attached to advocacy and organizing that advanced important causes during a crucial period when Tennessee cities were navigating the aftermath of civil rights legislation and the ongoing resistance from white supremacists who rejected equality, regardless of what federal law required, and whether he was a real person whose documentary traces somehow failed to survive in sources beyond newspaper coverage, or whether he was a sophisticated fiction maintained by progressive organizers working with sympathetic reporters to create public presence for their work, while protecting actual participants from retaliation, may never be definitively determined, because the people who would know the truth have died or have chosen silence over revelation. The 47 newspaper articles remain as evidence of something, whether of a person or of a strategy, marking a form of resistance that required indirection and collaborative deception to survive in an environment where honest advocacy for justice invited consequences that many people couldn't accept, but where the causes themselves mattered enough that activists found ways to continue their work through whatever means protected them while still advancing their goals. The truth about who Gregory Vincent Lattimore was or whether he existed at all matters, less than understanding that Murfreesboro's progress toward racial justice and social equality during the 1970s came through organized effort by people who faced serious risks for their participation, and who developed sophisticated strategies to balance effective advocacy against necessary protection from violent backlash, and that the documentary record from that period preserves not straightforward historical truth, but rather traces of resistance movements that operated partially underground, out of rational fear, while still managing to influence public discourse and policy in ways that gradually shifted their community toward greater justice, even when that progress came slowly and incompletely, and through means that sometimes required deception that historians now struggle to decode and evaluate. The phantom activist, whether that accurately describes Gregory Vincent Lattimore or not, represents an approach to organizing under oppression that deserves recognition as part of civil rights history, even though its very nature makes that history difficult to document and impossible to tell with the kind of clear attribution and verified facts that conventional historical narratives require, leaving us with mysteries embedded in newspaper archives and with questions about how many other such mysteries wait undiscovered in the documentary records of southern cities that navigated similar transitions through resistance strategies that had to remain partially hidden to protect the people who employed them. Subscribe now so you won't miss our next investigation into the American communities, where newspaper archives preserve traces of resistance movements that had to operate through shadows and deception to survive the violent opposition they faced for daring to advocate that everyone deserves equal treatment, regardless of race or class or any other characteristic that traditional hierarchies used to justify systematic oppression.